Hello, it's Ruby, and I did admittedly not film this video last month, even though I swore that I would do it every single month. So instead I'm going to compile May and June and tell you about all of the books that I read in both of those months. I probably will be a tiny bit shorter in my reviews than usual. And I'm having to scroll quite a long way back, it feels, on Storygraph. So I mean, the last book of April was The Enchanted April, I believe. The first book I read was actually an academic book. I read it for university preparation because, if you didn't know, I'm starting my Masters in Early Modern Literature at Oxford University in the autumn, and I read this fascinating book. I was only going to read like an extract of it, and then I ended up loving just the research style and the writing style so much that I read the full thing. It's called Handwritten Newspapers, an alternative medium during the early modern and modern periods, and basically it's about how newspapers came to be. It explores kind of the transition of handwritten letters to handwritten newspapers to printed newspapers, and how they're kind of all connected, and how the passing on of news is intrinsically linked to letter writing and to sharing information through letters. Initially, before newspapers were a thing, news is like a currency. When we have news before other people have news, we can kind of use that information to our advantage, I suppose. With news as a currency, it was only really shared among upper class circles and people who were influential. It fueled an aristocracy. But then that went into handwritten newspapers, which are actually really expensive. They would again just be circulated among people who could afford them and who could afford to have like the news written out for them and sent to them on that day. But then that went into printed newspapers, which is a much more egalitarian, accessible format. Obviously when they kind of first came about though, issues of meritocracy still are very much there, because not everyone is literate in Victorian society and modern society. Yes, it's accessible, but actually is the information accessible because of literacy? Yeah, very rambly, and obviously like it goes into much more depth, but I just love the way it was laid out, kind of intersection between letters and newspapers. It's really, really cool, and an angle I've never like heard before. So the next one I read is Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, which was recommended to me by my librarian, and he said that the ending of this is one of his favourite endings of any book of all time, and obviously I trust his opinion, so I took it out that day and I started reading it that evening. It's kind of a bit 1984-esque in that you've got the party, which is this totalitarian, very like kind of dictatorial state. So it's basically about this man who has dedicated the whole of his life to starting up the party. In the book though, he's being imprisoned by the state that he helped to establish. These circles of time and kind of comeuppance, I suppose, are very much like at the forefront of the book, but it's just like such a psychologically interesting book, and I love how it plays with like truth and fiction. The writing style is very direct and very militant, but there's also a kind of whimsy to it because of how confusing it is. Like, you're never sure if he's hallucinating something or if it's really happening, and we keep on like moving between dreams and real life and the past and the present, and it's like the overlapping, the layered narratives are so interesting, and it's a really cool piece of postmodern fiction. I would agree as well that the final section is just like beautiful. It's so wonderful, and like the book is worth reading for those final 3 pages. I would say that if it hadn't been for those final 3 pages, I probably wouldn't recommend this book. Next I read The Problem That Has No Name by Betty Friedan, which is a really seminal essay. It's it's really, really short as well, and it's an essay about womanhood and femininity in the 1960s and the kind of like archetypal ideal of becoming a housewife. It's kind of deconstructing the idea of the American dream and this idea of like domestic perfection, which so many women were taught to idealize, and the essay is really good. It's kind of like the idea of the problem that has no name. It's the dissatisfaction that women might feel when in these domestic roles they're expected to be happy but they're not, so it's a problem that has no name, and it's very good. Next book, very different. I read Guardians of Magic by Chris Riddell. Chris Riddell is my favourite illustrator. I am obsessed with his work, and this is one of his children's books. I think he's just such like his illustrations, I read his books for his illustrations. They're so detailed, so clever, so different, and Guardians of Magic is a kind of intertextual children's book. They live in a world which is kind of loosely inspired by fairy tales, so there's a lot of intertextual like children's literature within it, which I think is really cool for kids to read. I wish I'd read it when I was younger. I would have loved it. Next I read The Art of Poetry of Horus which is an essay on why poetry is important. I liked it. I thought it was an interesting essay. I read it when I was doing early modern master's preparation again, because this essay kept on coming up as being really influential and was used a lot in education for boys, and so I just thought I'd read it. I read Little by Edward Carey, which was so, oh my gosh, 5 stars, so excellent. Probably one of the top books I'm going to recommend on in this video today. It's like a fictionalized biography of the woman Marie who founded Madame Tussauds in London. So it's kind of grounded in historical research, and the setting is pre-revolution France. It starts with her in kind of like David Copperfield Bildungsroman style. It starts with her as a young child, and then follows her right through her career, and just the writing is so good. I don't know, it's just it's very compulsive writing, but it's also intelligent, and that's quite a hard balance to play, so Edward Carey does this very well. There are some really fascinating historical details in here though as well. So she spent some time living in the palace while Marie Antoinette and King Louis were on the throne, and kind of actually met both of them. But servants and ladies in waiting and people who served the royal family would sometimes have cupboards. Their rooms would be actual cupboards, large cupboards, and they would sleep in the cupboard in the room of the person who they waited on, and then they could be called on at any moment. I had no idea about that, and I thought it was made up, and I searched it up and it was actually real. How shocking is that? Next I read Nettle Eater by Tom Hiron. It's really short, it's only 26 pages, it's saying on Storygraph, and just kind of read it because I had a spare half an hour and thought, this looks interesting. It was wonderful, one of the best things I've read. It's a mixture between poetry and prose, and kind of magical realism-ish, but even not. It's kind of hallucinogenic and just very different from anything I've read. It feels quite witchy as well. It's this man who decides that he's going to live in nature and from the land for an entire year and only eat stinging nettles. All of these revelations and Damascene moments, and I don't know, it's very hard to describe, but it's worth reading, and I would highly recommend buying a copy. I also read Householder by Gerard Woodward, which is a collection of poetry, and there were some poems in here that I really enjoyed. Some of them are quite graphic, I'll just give as a warning. I really love how he takes the home and writes poetry about the home, but makes it serious and emphasises its importance for the individual. I just think it's quite refreshing, and especially actually for a male poet in the 1990s. Then I read this book by Voltaire, The Sincere Huron, A True History. I didn't think too highly of this. I don't think I've read any other Voltaire. This was the first thing. So it's basically about this boy, a child of nature. He crosses the Atlantic and comes to France, and then he's given this very European education. It kind of separates him from European culture, and sometimes that is presented as a good thing, but it just feels quite uncomfortable. It kind of feels like a colonial piece of literature when reading. Then I read Poetry in the Making, catalogue of an exhibition of poetry manuscripts by Philip Larkin, compiled by him, and he took key poems by prolific poets and then put in scans of their first drafts of a poem, and you could see how they crossed things out, and then for each poem there was an essay about it too. It was really short, but it was good, and I'm really interested in that process of writing, and it's called genetic criticism in English, and it's something I'm really interested in. It's quite an outdated form of criticism, but one that I personally really like. Then I read Maurice by E.M. Forster, which was definitely it's been so high on my TBR for ages, and I really liked it. I love the setting, is it Cambridge or Oxford? But the Oxbridge setting, the university setting, and also the fact that this was written in, just checking out, 1971, and yet it champions a very openly gay relationship. Well, they're not open about it, but we as a reader are very aware of it, and it's not presented in a negative way at all. It's this pure, very beautiful love. I think especially because they're so young, because they're practically boys. It just seems like a very pure love between them, and then that's tainted by everything around them and kind of what they're expected to do. Like, I've heard it said before that this book paved the way towards like Call Me By Your Name. Without Maurice, Call Me By Your Name couldn't really have happened. Yeah, I don't know, it's just like it's a really beautiful story, beautiful love story. I will say E.M. Forster's writing isn't my favourite to read, but I still really enjoyed this because I love the story so much. Just like personal preference, I'm not a big fan of Forster's writing style. Next, I reread Terms and Conditions, Life in Girls' Boarding Schools, but from 1939 to 1979. It's this woman who goes around and interviews women who were at these boarding schools between these dates, and basically like creates this compendium of what it was like to be at boarding school at this time, and mainly debunking a lot of the myths. Like, we tend to think of boarding schools like Enid Blyton presented them, very like happy, hello, jelly and custard, picnics and midnight feasts, and she's debunking these myths and kind of giving an insight into actually what was quite a cruel environment, and yeah, it's kind of like separated into chapters for the different areas of school life, but it's really interesting. And I love books like this, which are like works of journalism but taking very real people's stories and like compiling them together. It's a bit like Alexandra Robbins' The Overachievers book. Then the book of the month for May was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett, which I reread, of course. This is one of my favourites, and it was so great to read this over on Fable with everyone. It's just such a beautiful book. She's like such a mean-spirited child at the end, but then nature and the natural world is able to kindle something in her, and so it really triumphs the power of the natural world. Then oh yeah, I literally read the June book of the month straight after finishing The Secret Garden. It's very weird to see them both next to each other. But that was Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. Very male-centric narrative, I will say. Like, very male. It's three men in a boat. And so maybe that's a clue as to how it's going to present, like, gender. But whenever women do appear in this book, it's actually almost laughed when you're wondering, is this satirical, like intentionally? Like, every time a woman appears, they just have no, like, literally they're just this facade of somebody wanting to appear like beautiful and delicate. That's it. Like, there is no character to them, no substance, and it's very infuriating to read whenever a woman comes up. So I would much rather women had not been in it at all than how they did appear. But basically this is about three men who decide to go on a boat trip together, basically along the Thames, and it's all of the hilarious things that happen on this trip, and it is funny. It is a funny book. Oh, so we're into June now, so we've done all of May. I didn't read that much in May, actually. I read Yellowface by R.F. Kuang, which was one of my most anticipated books being released this year. She also wrote Babel, which was excellent, but I would say I enjoyed Yellowface even more than Babel, which I was not anticipating, because like the dark academia setting of Oxford and Babel is kind of part of the allure for me, and I really enjoyed that as a setting. But Yellowface, just I enjoy the political and the like social criticism that it's making, and it's also a thriller. It's very fast paced, very compulsively readable. I read it on the train back from Hay Festival and read it very quickly. So it's about a woman who her friend dies and has left behind this manuscript which is finished, and she like sees it in her typewriter and takes it and then publishes it under her own name and publishes it as her own. Goes on to achieve incredible commercial success, but obviously it's raising all of these questions about authorship, kind of culpability, whether she should have done it or not, and Kuang does so well to actually, because it's narrated by the person who steals this book, to like justify, like, the stealing author is justifying why she did it, and there are moments where you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense, and then you have to like check yourself and go, wait, no, this is really, really bad. So in that sense, it's a little bit Lolita-ish, and definitely an incredible feat to get into the mind of a character like that. But yeah, it's exploring like race politics in the publishing industry, problems in the publishing industry, as you can probably guess from the title and the cover. The idea is that so the woman who was the author who died she's written this book about Chinese labourers in the First World War, and she herself is a Chinese American writer, but the author who steals the book has no Chinese heritage, and so it's also raising these questions about like appropriation. But yeah, it was really good, and I really enjoyed the questions that it was raising. My camera's about to run out, so I think I'm probably going to leave it there and do the rest tomorrow. Cool. Alright, I'm actually back. The next book I read is The Last Tycoon by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Name suggests The Last Tycoon. This is the last book that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, and he didn't manage to finish it before he died, so it is unpolished, and it's like, I do think it's noticeably unpolished, honestly. Like, Fitzgerald is a fantastic writer, and the world building, the kind of like the setting, the atmosphere of the space, it's set in 1920s Hollywood, and it's rich and it's breathing with this atmosphere, but also just the storyline does not feel that fleshed out. I don't know, it feels unfinished. It feels like an early draft, and it doesn't fit together as cleanly as his other books, and it doesn't feel like his other books, and like tailored as his other books. And it's not to say that it's bad writing, like obviously it's still great, he is an exceptional writer, but it's more like in contrast to his other books, it's not as great. Next book is The Miseducation of Cameron Post by Emily Damsford. Really liked the film, so was excited to read this, and it's been on my TBR for ages. Also, obviously June is Pride Month, so it seemed like a perfect time to read it. So this is about, I think it's set in the 1980s or 90s, and the whole book does feel very nostalgic for summer. It's a great book, I think, to read during the summer. Very, very detailed descriptions. Follows a teenager called Cameron. She's gay, and the first half of the book is basically her relationships with other girls, and most of the stuff happens during the summer. Danforth kind of like skips over like the winters and autumns and springs. Most of it's like just a series of summers. Some people I've spoken to haven't liked how overly descriptive it is, so if you don't like overly descriptive books, this book might not be for you, but I personally really do love that, and I really enjoyed the tiny observations that she made, like just these small things that you do notice in childhood, or you do notice when you're a teenager, but you kind of forget that you'd noticed. It's like a very strange nostalgic feeling to read this book, so would highly recommend it. The second half of the book, and this isn't spoilers because it is on the blurb, she ends up being sent to a gay conversion camp, and so the book is very important in that regard for just, you know, like showing what conversion camps are like, and raising awareness about the fact that they actually do still exist. The book does feel like two different books, honestly. Like the first part before the camp and then during the camp, they feel very, very different, like distinctly different. It feels like two different books, honestly. And I actually really enjoy that. I think it's like partly the point, but it's thus playing with form in quite interesting ways. Like content wise it's heavy, but like writing wise it's quite easy to read. So next I read, these were all for a readathon actually, so I won't talk about these too much. I don't really like to talk about readathon books too much, but I read Kidnapped by Robert Louis Stevenson. This is like a Treasure Island-esque adventure, and very like Victorian boys fiction. Honestly, just like felt very like stock boys fiction. If you like adventure books, maybe you'll like this. And then I also read Measure for Measure by Shakespeare, which is one I hadn't read before. It's his most like controversial play, like lewd and bawdy, and was actually banned. It was like left out of the 1620s folio, and then the family Shakespeare like decided not to include it, known as being one of his like more problematic plays. The play is mainly about premarital sex, and it's a society, or like kind of this new ruler decides that it's going to be illegal and punishable by death, and that's kind of the setting. It's definitely a comedy. Obviously there are tragic elements, like someone picked me up on this actually saying like, well actually maybe it is a tragedy. I think genre in Shakespeare is really hard to pin down. Like it's categorized as a comedy, and when there's marriage at the end, like we tend to call it a comedy, but like the boundaries between tragedy and comedy are kind of blurred, much more like something like Comedy of Errors than, for example, like King Lear. I also read The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, or like finally finished it, because I've tried reading this twice. I said in the video it was only once, but actually I realised it's twice. I started reading it in like 2019, and then I started reading it again in 2020, and both times I just never finished it, even though I really loved it. I think just because it's quite a long book, maybe, I just kept on putting it down, and then not picking it back up. This book is so wonderfully spooky, and like the atmosphere is fantastic, and it's gothic, but it's also like a lot like the Brontes. Honestly, one of my favourite things is that it jumps between different narratives, a little bit like in Dracula. So you have like the narrative of Cartwright, you've got the Catherick's, and it kind of just like moves between different people and different parts and sections narrated by different people, and it kind of just like, and I really like that because it makes the whole thing feel like a testimonial, and like different evidence is being brought in. And actually at the beginning of the book it says, the story here presented will be told by more than one pen, as the story of an offence against the law is told in court by more than one witness, which I just love. It's basically a mystery story, and Cartwright, who is an art teacher who's travelling out to like work for this rich family in the English countryside, he comes across this woman in white and doesn't know who she is. She kind of like appears like a ghost, and he's not sure of her identity. He tries to ask who she is and everything, but like just never gets an answer, and he's told then later that this woman has escaped from an asylum. And then when he arrives at his like new position as an art teacher, he realizes that the woman in white looks a lot like somebody there at the house. And yeah, basically it's a detective story, it's a mystery, and it's just like, it's just very good. It's really, really good. It's very compulsive, but obviously not that compulsive because I never finished it until just now. The next book I read is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. I'd read extracts of this because I really love the writing style, but I've realised that I enjoy it more as a book to dip into and to read sections of, as opposed to reading in full. I don't really like it as much as a novel. I think I prefer it more as like single pieces of like writing. And like, it's a good book, don't get me wrong, it's a good book, and it's magical. So it's about these two circus performers who are being trained up to perform in this circus. It's clever, it's innovative, it's interesting, and I do enjoy the story, but I think my hopes were just like really too high for this, because the writing and the world building is maybe better, in my opinion, than the plot. I was reading it much more for the writing style and the atmosphere than for the plot. But I love the world building. Her use of language is so beautiful, and she's able to conjure space so well, and I just want to read like a massive expanse of just like descriptive writing from her. And then the final book that I read in June was Wait, was it? No, yes. I'm just looking at this here, and I didn't read a book for 9 days. So the final book I read was Shy by Max Porter, Max Porter's latest book. Max Porter is my favourite living writer at the moment. I love his work, and I love how experimental his fiction is. I've already spoken about this book a couple of times, but Shy is an examination of toxic masculinity, boyhood, and mental health, explored through a teenage boy in the 1990s. And he's judged societally, and he's sent to this home for troubled teens. And the book is kind of like emphasising the importance of the welfare state and why this is needed, and also just kind of like the essentiality of human kindness, I suppose. It's a very life-affirming book and experimental fiction, and Max Porter's using like, he embeds like thoughts and speech and phrases like all together in a mass expanse of prose, and it kind of sounds more like, it sounds like you're overhearing things, and it feels jumbled in the way that thoughts are jumbled, and I think that's a really hard thing to try and capture. But I would say that the really great bit, like even if you don't get into this book at the start, like really bear with it, because the ending, like the last 40 pages are the best bit. Like at the pond, the bit at the pond, as soon as you get to the pond, it's like amazing from there. I'd say up until the pond, it was like, I would have given it maybe like a 4 stars, but the pond scene was like 5.5 stars. Like, it was so good. I've gone back and reread it since. I just think it's excellent. So it's a very short book, but bear with it until you get to the end. Anyway, they are all of the books that I read in May and June. I don't actually know what that was. So I read 22 books in May and June, and yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching. I hope you walked away with a few book recommendations, and I think I'll probably do another video like this at the end of the summer, like for July and August, because I quite liked filming 2 months together. But thank you for watching, and I hope you have more than just a productive week.